we're doing a campfire session today. So we're going to try to present for 15-ish minutes. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions and discussion. We'll actually have some prompts as well. But if you see something in the presentation or if you have a hot burning question right now, go ahead and type it into the chat. I'll be happy to read through those when we get there, or I'll call on people if people would like to turn their camera on and ask it. We're open to any and all participation. So as a quick intro, I'm Brett Renfer, creative director at Blue Cadet. We make interactive experiences mostly for museums. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm a white male with clear glasses, wearing a blue striped shirt with a funny crunchy part today. And I'm calling from Brooklyn, the ancestral lands of the Lenape people.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kim. I go by the pronouns she, her, and I am of Asian descent, and I have black hair and also a little bit of blonde. I'm wearing kind of a red jumper today. I'm also calling from Brooklyn, and I'm an associate creative director at Blue Cadet. Okay, so our presentation today is called Can't Touch This, The Promise and Perils of Gestural Interaction. We'll be kind of diving into our learnings from our previous experiences of utilizing gestural interactions and observations that we've had, and shortly followed up by a discussion so that we can really dive into and see what's in the future for gesture interactions.
So we figured we start with a little loose credentials, so of some past projects. So in my previous life, I worked at a place called the Rockwell Group Lab. In 2014, we did this giant project for Google where you could filter tens of thousands of images using your presence and gesture. Sharing this not because we think it's like an amazing project, but it was a little bit of a, here's how we learned what we know. So for this one, I made a custom gestural engine, wrote our own code, installed a bunch of like custom cameras. It was a lot of craziness that I do not wish to do over. So happy to dig into some of those learnings today.
And in my previous life, I worked with local projects and also with the Cooper Hewitt Museum to create this gesture-based interactive called Gesture Match. The idea was that you will be utilizing your body to almost search their archives. And depending on the gesture that you've posed, it will bring up a collection item that was related to that gesture. This was in 2016, so this is when machine learning was definitely not a thing. All of these gestures were manually drawn to detect the data source. So like Brett, I don't want to ever do this exercise again, but we'll be addressing this in our talk, but the technology has been advancing that something like this is actually quite readily available to us to execute. But a lot of learnings from here as well, and we'll be addressing that in our presentation.
And so recently, like a lot of people, during the pandemic, we started thinking about the kind of past, present, and future of kind of touch-free design. And gestures are a big part of that. So we did a lot of different kind of R&D and experiments and thinking and writing. This is kind of like a piece of that puzzle as well. So these are some of the experiments we did. And I should say, as a brief pseudo definition, when we're talking about gestures today, we're talking about interactions that use your hands, body, face, combination of any of the above, that have some kind of antecedent in the real world. So do something that might be meaningful even outside of a system, and trigger some type of virtual content. So we'll go through each of these kind of pieces individually, but really our talk is about here's the sort of things that we should all be considering when we're concepting, designing, installing, and all of the above a gestural-based installation. So we'll go through each of these individually, and then we're happy to revisit or talk to any of these in the discussion session.
So the first point that we'll be addressing is with any kind of interactive experiences, we need to think about where your audience is coming from and kind of like the demographic of your visitors. And the additional layer of complication with gesture interactive is this idea of like how much exposure they might have of these gesture-based experiences. The most likely scenario is that on large touch screens, most people wouldn't have had any kind of level of exposure. Today, majority of the people know how to interact with touchscreens because it's so ubiquitous within our daily lives. But with gesture, it's such a new experience, a new interaction that is not fully integrated into our daily lives that we might need like a heavier hand in guiding visitors to help them understand how to engage. And then even though visitors might not have had any firsthand experience, I think another thing to consider is that through sci-fi movies, they would have been exposed to this idea of what these like magical gestural tech would look like. Minority Report being one of the kind of the poster child for it, where when you think of gesture-based interaction, you think of Minority Report. So in that case, like there is this kind of level of expectation where they want to have this kind of rewarding output or like this magical feedback and have ample amount of abilities they could possibly have with gesture. So it needs to be quite rewarding and really propel people to keep doing it. A really good example that is actually in existence today is this Connect game called Just Dance, where it gives you quite a bit of like playful animations and feedback loop in order for them to teach you these like very complicated movements, because it is, you know, it's almost like teaching you how to dance. And when you execute the right move, it gives you that kind of spark and that reward to help the users keep trying it out. And then kind of finally, another thing to consider is that there will be audiences group that might actually do get it. We do live in this very heavily TikTok driven Instagram filter world where gesture is now kind of more integrated into these apps. So the younger audiences might actually have had the chance to try it out on their own kind of devices and technology. And so just considering that level of demographic as well. So the thing to keep in mind is that it is quite a bit of a spectrum of like, there might be people who have absolutely no exposure, have no idea what this gesture interactive is, versus people who might have had a little bit of a touch, might have tried it in these like event spaces and things like that. So you need to consider like, what is the best onboarding mechanism for the type of visitors that you have and what mechanics might be the most effective. You really can't assume that like someone knows anything, and if they do, they might actually have very unrealistic expectations of what the experience you're actually providing. So at times you might actually need to over explain, be very clear as possible in the actions that you want visitors to take. So an example of that is like how to dance the robot dance, and it's almost like an instructional manual that we see right here. And it might be, we might have to consider being as overt as this, of like almost diagramming out the gesture that we want the visitors to take.
So when it comes to the technology, or a little bit of like the how, there's a lot of different things we can say, but one of the big pieces is just this idea of thinking about change. So preparing for change over time, especially if you're considering doing something that might be permanent. So if we look at a timeline of even the last 10 plus years, things have changed a lot, you know, in the kind of the before Connect era, BK, this is possible, but you're doing things with a more heavily customized kind of computer science heavy background. With the advent of Connect in 2010, suddenly you had pretty good data. You could see someone's skeleton. You had some of these things off the shelf. It's kind of democratized these more, university-based tools. And then most recently, you're seeing people use AI, machine learning algorithms to extract the data you need for gesture-based interactions, or even do gesture recognition automatically, and sometimes with even cheaper off-the-shelf kind of webcams and hardware. And so most recently, you know, Snapchat and Instagram and others are baking kind of gesture recognition into their apps, some of which are kind of free asterisk for use. But very, you know, dependent on the kind of output or things you're making. So regardless of the technology, you kind of end up with some version of this recipe. You think about using hardware of some kind to capture people, usually some type of camera. And then you have this like multi-part software part where you're kind of, you know, looking at the data and extracting something useful. So whether you're cutting out people, looking at their skeleton, looking for their hands, something like that. You have another part that's saying, let's match what I've extracted to a gesture. Yes or no, this is happening, or how much or how little is it happening? And then you have your content. You're reacting to that data and creating something beautiful and hopefully educational and all those things with that. So the last, 10 or so years, this sort of recipe looked like this. You'd use a computer and probably a Kinect or RealSense or Asus Action or whatever depth camera was your favorite. You were using some kind of off-the-shelf algorithm, either a free one like the Kinect SDK or others like NuiTrack to extract a skeleton typically, or some kind of data. And then you're using a part where you're matching it to a pose. So, the thing that Kim was talking about with gesture match, like matching that to content, or saying, are you or are you not doing something? And then of course, the last part is typically custom, hence magic. So as another prototype from our explorations around gesture and touchless design, our colleague Adiel Fernandez made this one. So this one is, we're using, you can see the Kinect in the foreground, it's connecting and computer. It's looking for this binoculars gesture. And the moment he does it, it kind of pushes the software into another mode and starts to react to his position in another way. And then looking towards the near future, I think there's this really interesting thing where these pieces are becoming somewhat cheaper, although sometimes they're a little trickier to use, but you're starting to be able to use, a computer, and the computer could be something more like a Raspberry Pi that's cheaper and off the shelf, like simple color web camera, because you can feed it into, a super smart AI. Hopefully someone else has even trained it for you, that is just looking for gestures. So not without problems, there's plenty of things to talk about with AI and machine learning, but really just to say that not only is the system somewhat getting simpler, but also it's really different than it was before. And so I think that idea of considering which pieces of this recipe are sort of swappable over time. If you're installing something for 5 years, you really have to think about, can I change the hardware? Can that part change? Which part is fixed? Which part is variable? And are these things all in service of this being like a good experience? And as a quick aside, there are other ways that are being solved. Hardware is another one. Right now, we think this is like too cumbersome, like asking your visitor to put on 4, 6 or more little wearables to recognize their gesture seems like a lot. But the little GIF in the foreground is HoloLens is like built-in gesture. Those things are promising, and there might be more cool, quick pieces of hardware that are simpler to get started and play with. We want to say, we're excited to see where this goes.
With the technology and like kind of the experience as a whole, we need to start to also think about the affordances that are needed for those type of technology. There's a great quote by Vic Parthiban from the MIT Media Lab that kind of addresses 3 different kind of affordances that we have to really consider. This is from an article that he wrote in Critique of the Gestures that were interactions that were coming up with like your personal phone. And this was his critique where like, in order for gesture interactions to be really effective, there needs to be a decent amount of real estate. You need to have the right levels of precision and position, and whether the application is appropriate and it's the right kind. So that's something to kind of pinpoint here, that as we were kind of like investigating these gesture interactives, we realized that when people are moving their bodies, they need quite a bit of space. Like we don't want people to flare their arms and hit each other. There were some accidents that didn't quite happen in even our body storming exercise, that we realized that, there needs to be at least kind of a 6 feet radius around each person. If it's, a kind of a multi-user collaborative kind of interaction, there actually needs to be more, because again, like I said, we don't want people to hit each other in their faces. And another layer of kind of consideration is that there might need to have kind of a designated space for privacy. So doing a gesture and things like that can be quite awkward. It could be quite vulnerable. So that's also something to have in mind. In addition to just like the real estate that individuals need, depending on the technology, there are very specific spatial requirements to make sure that sufficient data is being captured. And we need to take into account of that, of like how much of the limitations the technology might have and how we can accommodate that within the space that we are providing. And then another thing to keep in mind is like once people are including each other, that might quite feel nice for the visitor, but in the point of view of the tech, it actually might not, because it will hinder the capturing of the data. And then the final element is that everything needs to kind of work together, and what surrounds the experience really do matter. Thinking about the scale of the content on the screen, what kind of printed graphics will actually help guide the visitors, in addition to additional kind of call to actions onto the interactives themselves. So everything needs to be very cohesive and needs to work together in order for gestural interactions to be very effective. And then the next kind of like bucket of items for us to consider is, we can't leave this out, content. Content is super important in kind of like thinking about what gestures really feel appropriate. The thing to have in mind is that gestures have meaning. Like you doing that action, it can provoke kind of a certain level of mood, a type of role, or even a character that you're playing within the story. So you have to really be critical on what kind of gesture ties in with your content. The gesture that you are doing is actually part of the story. You have to consider like, how are you positioning the visitor and what kind of role are you asking your audiences to play? But the strength in doing that kind of critical thinking around the types of gesture that you are tying your, within the content that you're providing is the fact that this is encouraging kind of a multimodal learning. It's a very different way of experiencing your content beyond the touchscreen, beyond the reading, beyond just a printed graphic. So it really emphasizes the experience of immersing the visitors in the content that you are providing. And then finally, this is kind of like a must in the process of investigating those gestures, that you actually have to try it out, and you acting it out and doing the gestures themselves, you'll realize the limitations that it might have, or the character that you're actually putting the visitors into might not quite feel right within the content that you have. So try it out, body storm it. I did a lot of them. I felt really awkward, but that is also part of the exercise of you trying it out. Will showcase what kind of gesture is appropriate.
This is the moment where we're jealous of our coworker from New Mexico's work from home life, where Kim is in her apartment and she's like in the mountains somewhere. So, you know, the last piece we wanted to talk through is among the most important, is just thinking about this idea of access and inclusion. There's a lot of different aspects we can talk about, whether some of this meaning is even very Western centric, but we'll focus specifically on accessibility to start. So, you know, starting with this piece, you know, we use this and other kind of like toolkits to think about design of physical casework and physical interactives, to think about designing for reach. But I think it's really helpful to look at and think about when you're thinking about gesture as well. So thinking about, you know, what gestures are available to this person in a wheelchair, thinking about what is that canvas that's actually available to them, but also noting that even in this diagram, this is considering someone who has full range of motion of their arm. So how do you think about a range of abilities of users and visitors, and can they participate in your experience, and in what ways might they participate? So one way to start to think about that is just thinking about alternatives. You know, so as Kim said, once you start to try things and start to act out and put yourself in these positions, you start to see these issues. And sometimes it might just be a simple solve. So, you know, on this prototype was thinking about this kind of grabbing or selecting content. So Adiel's original prototype on the left, you have to have full range of motion of your arm and fingers. But realize we can just use time, you know, and Wei Li's update on the right, you can see it doesn't really matter the sort of what he's doing with his hand or you know, how his fingers are positioned. You can still do something that within almost the same amount of time to do a simple kind of gesture to be selecting something. You can even see the camera's a little closer to him. He doesn't have to use his arm as much. So I think it's not perfect, but it's an example of a way to start to think about ways you might refine your gesture to be more accessible for more users. So these slides are an imperfect or incomplete metric, but you know, starting to think about as you're looking at all these different aspects, once you think you have something that fits perfectly and naturally with your content, starting to think about, can a huge amount of people perform this gesture? Why or why not? Will people want to do the gesture? Even, you know, Kim noted this idea of privacy. That's a piece of the puzzle, but you know, will people feel like the gesture is appropriate to the content? And are there ways in for everybody? You know, if some things require a different level of physical exertion, are there alternatives? And lastly, are those alternate modes just as special and considered? You know, what are people going to feel like if they can't do the gesture and have to do something different that feels more like it's been slapped on or added at the last moment? Trying to think about this suite of inputs and options for people that give a lot of ranges in for people, and thinking about, again, access and inclusion from the start. So really, our talk is not saying don't ever do gestural interaction, or it's way too hard. It's saying that there are, like really all interactive experiences, they sit at this intersection, this tension point, that it probably is an even more complicated Venn diagram than this. But things we talked about is it possible technology? Is it possible spatially? Think about those considerations. Does it actually make sense for the story you're trying to tell? And does it include the maximum number of people? And are there ways in for around a huge range of people? So your amazing idea hopefully sits somewhere at the central point, but things like body storming, things like prototyping, things like testing are the ways to kind of get at each of these and push against these tension points. So hopefully we're going to kind of open up the floor here. Hopefully this will give you a suite of tools and ideas and things to think through. So I think we'd love to start first if people have questions for us, and then we have some prompts as there are there. And so again, you can use the chat and I can read them out, or if you'd like to unmute and your camera on or off is totally up to you, but please feel free to jump in as you'd like. Oh, Kim, you're muted.
I think I'm going to stop sharing for now, just so that we can see if people decide to jump in. If not, feel free to.
Robin, go ahead. Looks like you just unmuted.
Yeah, yeah, I have a question. Could you talk a little bit about the skills needed to design a gesture-based experience? How many people on a team do you need to have? Yeah.
I think it really depends on the type of product that you are pursuing, but usually it's probably it's good to definitely have a tech representative, a person who is very acquainted with the technology that's available, and then a person that's a little bit more design and user interaction focused, and then another person who might be kind of keeping an eye on content. So those kind of three, I mean, we had a 4 diagram, but those 3 disciplines all kind of being represented is actually quite important. And I see right here, one of the comments and comments in question was kind of around accessibility and having that as in the beginning. And ideally the 3 people who are involved in the project are constantly having that discussion as well. Sometimes at Blue Cadet, we do bring in a contractor who has a very specific skill set in keeping an eye on accessibility. And if that is kind of a primary goal, which it most likely will be, we bring in a contractor if we have the budget to make sure that we are taking into consideration of all the ADA compliances, as well as like the range of mobility that we will have to adapt our product for.
How complicated can a gesture get?
That's a really good and a really hard question. I would say that similar to the access and inclusion, and I see, Kelsey, I see your hand raised too, so I'll jump to you in a second. It is a little bit of like, how much can people take on from a cognitive standpoint? How much are they learning something? Like even looking at those dance games, they break out something that to a dancer might be, this is just one move, but this is now in like 5 steps or more. I think it depends on the duration of the interaction, the type of emergent behavior. So sometimes like that pterosaur example, once you kind of figured out to put your arms out, pretty much anything you do did something in the game. So it was complicated in the output it could create, but not complicated in the gesture. And when it comes to the technology, it's really dependent on the platform. Some things it's like you might just be moving too fast for the camera to see you, which is a real consideration. Kelsey, I think you had the first comment in the chat box too, and I see your hand raised, so go ahead and jump in. Nice to see you again too.
Yeah, nice to see you. The presentation was great. I've had some struggles trying to work with gesture stuff myself, and it's really interesting to see the considerations you've all taken into account. I was curious, one of the biggest challenges I came across was how to explain the gestures to visitors. So I was just curious what kind of like signage or instructions you provide so that people who maybe aren't familiar with gestures at all can understand without it being like a booklet.
I think it's, oh, go ahead, Kim.
No, go ahead, Kim.
I think we might be about to say the same thing. It's almost like as close to full scale and like a rotoscoped animation as possible. You know, it's like you want to see somebody doing it, especially if it's full body. And from there, you just get more into this kind of like universal design of iconography or action. I think it's depending on the steps, depending on the type of gesture, and as much as it can be like embedded in the experience. Like the minute you walk up, you're kind of assuming that people are starting from zero, and you're giving them as literal as a guide as possible. And sometimes you borrow things from video games. You know, video games are all about training and leveling up. So you might do the gesture as a part of like a let's get started kind of mechanism. And if it gets more complicated, you could stage that over time.
And we went over it very briefly in one of our slides about affordances and how like the surrounder graphics is actually really, really important. The low hanging fruit here is indicating where people need to stand. Like people want to understand the space that they can occupy. And so having that clearly marked is really important. And additionally to like what the product or like what the app is actually delivering you on the onboarding side of whether that's like a rotoscoped actual person, like doing the gesture that you want people to do, or if it's like, you know, iconography in support of that, if there's, you know, redundancy within the printer graphics, that's also very effective. I have a little anecdote where like we did a very, it's more of a presence-based game that we created for like a maker fair that one of our clients was hosting, and they invited us to participate. And it was very lo-fi. We just had the game and we were like, oh yeah, people will understand it. Nobody understood it. And so we used Post-it notes to see what would be the most effective in explaining what type of, you know, presence or action we wanted people to take. And the most critical part was exactly that, like making sure people know exactly where to stand, what the instructions are, all the different details of those printer graphics actually made a difference. I hope that's helpful.
This question from Kristen around whether we found if people, visitors learn more by using these gesture-based technologies. I would say it's nothing that we necessarily have objective data around. I would say that the gestures and things that both in our own work and things that we've seen that are simple and straightforward, but allow you to kind of play, people just tend to spend more time with them. You know, it is novel as long as it's it's like that idea of the low floor and the high ceiling. If it's really easy to walk in and just start doing something, if it's fun and interesting, people might spend more time. So I think you could extrapolate that people are hopefully learning something more over time through that. It depends on the gesture and the experience, but that's, I think, the best kind of measurable I would sort of have. The next question is around whether or not we have an example of an experience we've designed where we did include an alternative to the gesture. Kim, I was trying to think if we had an explicit piece.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of the prototypes that we shared was actually an R&D project that we had internally, because we were realizing, oh, there might be some, you know, because of the state of the world today, their touch might be quite, there was a world where we were afraid that touch might go away. So we explored all these like various different ways of incorporating gesture into our apps. And this was basically, by doing that exercise, we found a lot of these kind of observations. And so unfortunately, we don't have like a specific example that utilizes the alternative gesture, but that is something that we are considering. We actually, one of the projects might actually become a real product. And so that is in our forefront into considering what kind of additional gestures might be more appropriate for the visitors if they're a little bit more, if they have limited mobility. So we'll keep you posted.
Yeah, and I would say, candidly, I think there have been more times that a project has started as a gesture, and then the things that we talked about, especially the appropriateness to content, we more pushed into something more either static or presence-based, you know, that it's kind of like you just need to walk up or do something very, that requires less mobility, or there's kind of a fallback that is like a touch or alternate interface.
Great. The next question is from Jasmine. can you share examples as to how you've measured a user experience in the past with gestural interactions, whether that's pre-launch user testing or during a run of an exhibition or experience? I think it's a little bit of both. So one of the, we launched kind of a presence-based interactive for the Henry Ford Museum. And one of the, as part of the process, we did a big kind of user testing on site with the visitors to make sure that we're going to do a good job. And we did a little bit of A/B testing from there. And so making sure that that's incorporated into when you're designing, I think is pretty critical. This kind of like measurement of user experience is a little tricky because there will be post-launch and pre-launch and post-launch metrics that we might want to establish. So yeah, that's kind of like the tricky part. It seems like Jasmine, you're jumping in. Nope. Okay. I'm just hearing things now.
But yeah, I think echoing Kim said, testing things and testing with real people really early on. And we've done it. I think one thing that is kind of playful to think about is we've done it fully analog as well. We did do a gestural experience that was about becoming a sea creature that unfortunately didn't make it to the grant phase. But for testing that one, we realized that to create a prototype that actually worked, where you could walk up and have skeleton tracking, have gestures that like did different things, we'd have to make so many decisions in the prototype that we would basically be making the final experience. So instead, we actually decided to, we created this thing based on this old Marx Brothers movie that was like a pretend mirror. So people actually just dressed up as the creatures and mimicked gestures and held up like physical printed content that were the content takeaways. And it sounds insane, but it actually worked really well because we could react live, we could have this back and forth, and we did a traditional kind of users get a little bit of onboarding, they come and do the experience and they sit down with an evaluator and have questions about content takeaways and things like that. And we found really key points that we're feeding into when we actually write code and make this thing. So definitely think about ways that you could prototype without technology too.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear the prompt earlier to jump back in, but my team and our department is trying to think more about how we can advocate for testing during the creation of interactives. And so for, we're coming up with trying to come up with a set list of metrics and like KPIs that we can use where we create interactives, but we've never done anything in the gestural space, at least I haven't. So I'm interested to see or I would be interested to know if you're measuring like how long someone is engaging with an interactive, if there's like how you measure between, like on the data side, how you measure between experiences when there may be multiple people standing in front of the screen. So I don't know if that's like database or if you have a list of metrics that you commonly refer to, but that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, we unfortunately really have a standard. We actually have even done things like using the same camera and giving anonymized, but still kind of the analytics style data. And typically it's just depends on the experience. So even in the binoculars, when you saw, there was the first part of like, is someone there? Did they see it? And then did they do the gesture? And then how much time was spent before they walked away or did something else? So I think you can start to gate that experience to think about the duration and whether people got over those thresholds. So same with the Henry Ford, it was a little bit of, did someone walk by this column? So it was motion based. And then did someone actually, there was like this threshold you could cross to uncover the content. So that one we had sort of states that we were measuring. But it's all the things about, is it actually two people? Are they kind of crossing ways? Those are without investing in things that people use in like retail stores for tracking customers. Like that is how some people do it. We are just we're less scientific, to be honest, with that kind of data, because mostly that's okay. But I think I would put it in that sort of way. It's a little bit of like, did people see it? Did people do the gesture? How much time, like how far in the experience they go to? And just thinking about what are those sort of states you're getting into.
And if there's like a kind of a reveal or a final moment, that's also a really great gauge into how long people have endured to get to that point. Because usually with gesture-based interaction, that's like the reward is kind of the content moment that you are actually delivering. So that's also great kind of metrics for you to measure.
And the endure is a great segue into Josh's question, which is have you found that user fatigue is an issue with gesture-based interactives? 100%. I mean, that's the thing that why Kim was talking about the body storming. It's like once you try doing something, I mean, I don't lift enough to do all these gestures sometimes. Like you're just like, oh, if I'm doing this for like 5 minutes, my shoulder gets tired. And it's all kidding aside, it's like, it's super important to do those before you go down a world of making something, you know, and thinking about, are you doing something that's momentary? And then you're kind of resting and sitting back with content. Like, what is that relationship between active and inactive? And there's that's just physical fatigue. There's a cognitive part too, I think. But.
I mean, yeah, it's one of the biggest critiques of the Minority Report gestures is the fact that you're constantly having your arms up and you're having to do these finger movements, which is, I mean, accessibility wise, it's like completely not even feasible. But even doing those body storming exercises, you soon realize that, oh, I just want to do it once and I just want to be done. Like, I don't want to keep doing the gesture over and over for that to be kind of the norm for you to get the reward. So having, it's a little bit about like that cadence of the experience as well. Like what's the rhythm that we're allowing people to engage in and then rest. So yes, user fatigue is definitely a thing.
You know, I don't, do you, oh, there's another question. Go ahead.
It's okay. Keep going, Robin, and Kelsey, we'll get to yours next.
I was just remembering one of the first gesture-based experiences that I saw, which was at the Cleveland Art Museum a long time ago, where you could stand in front of a screen and you were supposed to mimic you could choose an artwork and you were supposed to mimic the pose of the artwork. And the learning behind that was how you felt in your body when you did that gesture from an emotional standpoint, you know, so it made you, which then fed back to, oh, if I feel like this emotionally, then that's how that person in the painting is supposed to have felt, or that person who was carved in the sculpture was supposed to have felt. And I thought that was a really effective use of gesture, you know, for a kind of learning that's, you know, it's embodied learning there, which is really not the same as learning it intellectually. You're suddenly feeling it in your body. So I was just pointing that out as a good example of a gestural experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the biggest benefit of these gesture-based interactives. I think, yes, there are a lot of considerations to be had, and I think it's a difficult process for you to really strike the right balance and have the right interactive, but it could be really effective if all of those elements have the right synergy and it will remain with the visitors a little longer than I think you touching the screen, for sure. Kelsey had a question. Have you established some guidelines for when you find gesture interaction to be effective versus other types of interaction? Not like a formal guideline. I think that was definitely the process that we wanted to get through for our R&D project. But these are kind of like the 5 pillars that we would say that is kind of the guidelines to, you know, make sure that the gesture interaction is effective. There are a lot of components there. We don't have a strict rubric just yet. And most likely that would have a hard metrics for us to like really pinpoint and like concretely put down. But we're hoping that this is definitely like kind of the considerations and the guidelines that we will be utilizing to create gesture interactives. And then I think as Jasmine that pointed out about the metrics of how do we build in some metrics to make sure that we can iterate on top of it.
Yeah, I think that the only thing we didn't talk about was there's also just like the duration of how long something is going to be installed. Most of our work is permanent, so we have a pretty high bar about whether we think something like that is appropriate. But I think that's a piece. If it's temporary, there's a lot more you can do. So we have about 5 minutes. So I'll try to go through a couple more of these. I think, Kristen, you asked a question that we were thinking about as well. It's like, do we think that gesture-based interactives will become more commonplace in museums? And it's a really hard answer. I think for the next year or two, because of people starting capital projects, you know, or restarting them post-pandemic, I absolutely think this is going to be like a crazy explosion of at least presence-based or people considering gesture-based. I think people are similarly thinking about, you know, device as gesture or a stand-in from like, you know, having a non-touch or a proximal-based interaction. I think it's hard to say because it's a little, even in the technology, it's not like an established, here's the best and easiest and quickest way to do it. I think until there's another thing that goes beyond the, like, I need to write C++ to make this thing work. I think that after that threshold, I think there will be more because it is really interesting and appropriate. And I think it depends on the museum and the content too. So that's sort of a non-answer, but I think we're thinking maybe.
I think we're hoping. Ali had a question around how inclusive gestures are for differently shaped and differently sized bodies. It is a concern that gestures might not read larger or smaller bodies in the correct position from a technical view. It really depends on which part of the body we're actually tracking for the data. The part that we actually, from previous experience, and Brett, you probably have more context than I do, but like height actually became kind of a tricky positioning because of the angles of the camera and how much it can capture. There are ways around it of like whether it's actually, you know, detecting more of the upper body or the lower body or things like that. But that also goes back to like accessibility again. So it's a tricky line to balance. Whether like people are a little bit more heavier set or lighter set, that has absolutely there's no kind of limitations within that. It actually was more about the height of the person. If there's like a 4-year-old that comes on versus like a 6'5" man, that's a very different kind of data set that the technology can capture. So that was kind of the tricky part.
Yeah, and I think, Ali, to your follow-up question about users in chairs too, I mean, I think most of the things, most of the hardware and software does an okay job with people in chairs. I think you kind of tend to prioritize upper body because of that then, because you'll see it has a really hard time, at least in my experience, like differentiating like legs, or sometimes they get kind of confused. So I think it's really important to test in this case. And, you know, it's a thing that's really hard. Like, in a way, we all become accountable for some AI machine learning that some other big corporate company has done, right? Like, it's like the reason those things are or not good are based on whether they trained with a really open data set and a lot of other people. But doesn't mean that we, as the, you know, whether you're the museum or the designer or somewhere in between, like, you don't get a pass from your users because of that, right? So typically I would say it works fairly well. It's really important to work on all the spatial parts of that too, you know, to make sure that even the positioning of your camera can have a big difference within that. And then do the testing, you know, and I think it's really, there's a lot you can do with just even saying like, I'm going to, you know, get an Xbox and try it or something like that too, like before you even get started on your own. But it's a really important note.
Okay, we have 1 minute until the session is done.
I would just say thank you for all the questions. I mean, I think these are all really helpful and represent a lot of the stuff that we are up against as well. So we'll post the slides. We put them on the Sched, and then we will add them to the Slack as well on the experience design thread. So please, I think we're both on the Slack too. So if you have another burning question, you can find us there, and then I'll be in the 3:15 wrap up as well.
Oh, good. Good. Yeah. Thanks so much. This was really informative, especially, you know, defining those 4 areas of consideration that people really need to think about: technology, access, content, and what was the 4th one?
Space.
Oh, yeah, space. Thanks a lot.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.